Good morning, everyone. The webinar will begin shortly.
Well, good morning, and thanks for calling in for today's webinar about DITA 2.0, our first release, which is not backwards compatible. I'm Chris Eberlein, Chair of the OASIS DITA Technical Committee, and I really want to welcome everybody to today's call. Just to give a brief overview of what we'll be covering in today's webinar, we have a little bit of information up front about housekeeping, and then we'll jump right into information about the technical committee who designed DITA 2.0, why we are doing a backwards incompatible release, and the bulk of our time will be spent looking at what's in DITA 2.0. We'll cover resources. We are hoping that everybody will download beta versions of our DITA 2.0 grammar files available in both DTD and RNG and take them for a test drive. And then finally, we'll do questions if we have, depending on time. Our plan will we'll definitely take simple questions when available today, so please keep them going in the chat. But our real plan is to handle those questions on the 29th. So again, our welcome and housekeeping, we will be recording this webinar and it will be posted shortly on the OASIS channel at YouTube. All attendees are muted. And again, please plan to attend our follow-up webinar on the 29th of June, 2 weeks from today at the same time. But do add questions to the chat. They'll be monitored during the session and we'll take the simple ones today, time permitting, and we will use more complicated questions to plan for our webinar on the 29th. So just to let you know, in addition to myself, there are 3 other members of the DITA Technical Committee on today's webinar. We have Robert Anderson, a voting member who represents Oracle. We have Deb Bizantz, a voting member who represents Basant, and Chris Nitchie, who is an individual voting member. So with no further ado, I think as most of you know, DITA is designed and maintained by the OASIS DITA Technical Committee. We have 16 voting members, we meet weekly, and we really cover a very wide variety of professional roles in the DITA universe. We're information developers, architects, content engineers, managers of departments, professors, consultants, application developers. And we do come from, if not all parts of the globe, from the US, from Canada, from Germany, and Israel. Quick list here of the folks that spend the time each week and time not in the TC calls working on driving our work forward. And a big thanks to all of them who've been very involved in the DITA 2.0 release. And the critical reason that we are doing this webinar, it is our first release that will not be backwards compatible. And we have planned for quite a long time to have DITA 2.0 to be a backwards incompatible release because we knew we needed to pay attention to reducing our technical debt, getting rid of features that were cumbersome, overlapping, really little used and unnecessary. We needed to fix design mistakes and do just the sort of general housekeeping that has to happen to a standard over time. That said, we know that a backwards incompatible release is going to make more work for everybody. It will require companies that have their content in DITA to make changes to their source. And there, of course, will be work for you all, vendors of DITA tooling, consultants who produce style sheets, anyone really in the DITA universe who builds tools or provides support to DITA users. And that's why we're doing this series of webinars. We really wanted to try to make sure that folks knew what was coming with DITA 2.0 early on, so they could start planning changes that need to be made to their products, to their services. We also are, the DITA Technical Committee, are really looking for folks to test DITA 2.0, to integrate it with your products and provide feedback as early as possible. So with no further ado, let's start looking at what's actually in this release. And we'll start by looking at the overall structure. It really will be delivered in two packages. We are separating the base and the technical content. And by technical content, we are talking about concept, task, reference, bookmap. While ideally we would be releasing these two packages simultaneously, we know that the base will be released first and that the technical content package will follow on shortly thereafter. I'm hoping that there's not going to be more than maybe a month or two difference between the two releases. And the reason that we are clearly separating the packages and going into separate release modes now is that it's going to allow us more flexibility in the future. For example, we would have liked to have made changes to the DITA 1.3 troubleshooting topic shortly after releasing 1.3, but we did not want to have to make changes to the entire base, the entire package. And separating these packages will give us more flexibility in the future if, for example, we needed to introduce just something that had an impact on technical content. So I know everybody is interested in what actually are the target dates. So I've given 2 dates here, and I want to stress that these are unofficial. These are not consensus dates from the DITA Technical Committee. These are my personal best guesses as chair of the DITA TC that will drive perhaps as targets. I would love to see that we would be able to release the base perhaps in October 2022 and the technical content in December 2022. But again, guesses, targets, we'll try to keep you posted as we move along. And then, of course, I know everybody is interested. We will, of course, have new DITA 2.0 doc type identifiers for topics and maps. So it's always challenging with a new release to figure out the best way to group the content, our different features, the changes we're making. And in this deck, they're simply grouped along, which are architectural changes, where we have improvements to particular features or elements or domains, new elements, new domains, behind the scenes changes, which will have greater impact, I think, for vendors than it does for your typical DITA users who author or produced it or architect DITA content. And then all the things that we are removing. Again, I expect to see the removal does have an impact for vendors, particularly we are no longer going to be shipping XSD versions of our grammar files. And changes, of course, the removal of deprecated items will affect source files. So let's launch right in here. Architectural changes. One of the things we are doing is we're improving how variable text is defined. Variable text using keys was first introduced in DITA 1.2 And over the course of releases 1.2, 1.3, I think our rules for resolving variable text got more and more complicated. And one of the clear use cases we wanted to address here is we wanted to make the rules for resolving variable text simpler for application developers. And we also wanted to make it much clearer on how variable text should be designed as content authors. So that was our use cases here. And as far as how we've implemented it, we are adding a new element called key text, and we've established new rules for how variable text defined using key references should be resolved and the priority of different elements. The implications of this will be hits to source files. Some DITA 1.x markup will be invalid. We do not expect that this will affect individual DITA topics, but this will involve changes to key definition maps where keys that define variable text have been defined. The second large-scale architectural feature that is part of DITA 2.0 is we have completely redesigned chunking. And this was a proposal that was championed by Robert Anderson at Oracle. I think we've known for a long time that chunking was very complicated. There was a slew of different tokens for the chunk attribute that were confusing, and it was difficult to implement. So the changes that we're making in DITA 2.0 is we're removing the 8 or so previously defined tokens for the chunk attribute and replacing them with just 2 new tokens, combine and split. So again, the implications here is there will be changes needed to source files, to DITA maps. The DITA 1.x tokens for the chunk attribute will not be recognized. And I will pause here since we do have Robert Anderson on the call. Robert, is there anything you'd like to add here about chunking?
I don't think so, just that we're really hoping that this will be simpler to use, simpler to understand, simpler to implement, all of the above.
Thank you. And folks, in general, if you note here that each of the slides you look at, we do have a use case, we have clear defined implementation, we do have implications. All of our planning work for DITA 2.0 has been focused on being driven by use cases, trying to figure out ways of implementing changes that are as simple and straightforward as possible. And of course, paying strict attention as we go along to what the implications of the changes we introduce to the standard would be for authors, for DITA content, for vendors. The next high-level architectural change is coming is we are relaxing some specialization rules. For all of us DITA practitioners who build document type shells and specializations and configurations for customers, we have long wanted to be able to be more targeted with our specializations, to add new specialized attributes and make them only available on certain elements, or to add new specialized elements and make them only available in specific targeted places. And we are enabling that for DITA 2.0. We're making it much simpler for people to introduce specializations and have them be more targeted. On a spec level, that means that we are introducing a some new terminology. We are going to be distinguishing between what is document type configuration, i.e. the configuration of a document type shell, and what is element configuration, the configuration of the content model or attribute lists for specific elements. In general, I don't think this has large-scale implications for vendors, but it does remove the need that some vendors had to hack the 1.x OASIS grammar files to selectively add attributes. This should enable anyone to be able to produce document type shells and specializations that follow all of the OASIS guidelines for how to code your document type shells and specializations. And this work was championed by Chris Nitschke, and then I have taken over much of the implementation work, which does not really hit the grammar files, but had a very large impact on the specification. I'll just pause here and say, Chris Nitschke, anything you'd like to add here?
Not particularly, except to say that this is something I've wanted in DITA since I've been involved with it, and I'm excited that it's finally happening.
You and me both. I think everybody who has built configurations for clients has wanted this. So this then takes us into talking about the more specific improvements to existing parts, features, or elements in DITA. And we have some improvements to bookmap. We were very careful here to make all these changes to bookmap be backwards compatible. We know people have made large investment in bookmap. And initially, we were hoping to introduce a new type of publication map for DITA 2.0. We weren't able to do that, but that is potentially on the roadmap for a follow-on DITA 2.x release. So the changes we're introducing here are simply to address the pain points that we know people have experienced. A need to apply a DITA val to an entire bookmap, and clear ways to specify resource-only objects. For example, key definitions, subject scheme maps in an intuitive location in the bookmap. So we made some minor changes to the content models of bookmap and booklist in order to permit this. And we added a new element in the map group domain called map resources, which solely has the purpose of containing resource-only objects and has the processing role set by default to resource only. That map group domain typically is integrated into both bookmap and regular DITA map, so it will be available in both places for people who are using out-of-the-box OASIS shells. And this is work I've done with also work from Eric Sirois of Ixiasoft. Another new change we're introducing is simply making some enhancements to flagging using DITA vals. And this is work that was championed by Robert Anderson of Oracle. And it enables folks to add output class to either prop or rev prop in a DITA val file and specify that the output class token, as it exists in the source content, will get passed through in HTML output as a class value to make it possible to style that output class in different ways. Robert, anything you want to add here?
This one's a little tricky to understand on the surface just because it involves data val, flagging, output class, class values. And so lots of terminology that sort of overlaps and can be thrown. But basically it's a way to say, you know, if I've tagged my content with platform equals Mac or platform equals Linux, platform equals Windows, everything tagged with that, I want a special HTML class attribute out there. So I can then have complete style control using CSS. So it's a more straightforward way to say anything tagged with a particular piece of metadata, put a specific HTML class on it to add to whatever's already there.
Thanks, Robert. Appreciate that. Another thing we've done, and this is work that was championed by Scott Hudson at ServiceNow, is simply made the example element available in many, many more places. And this will enable authors to be able to more semantically tag content as an example. So where it was typically only available as a peer to section in topics, it now can be available within sections, between paragraphs, in definition lists, figures, and more. And I think the major implication here is this probably will require people to make some changes to their style sheets in CSS, particularly for how example is handled when it is within sections or as a peer to paragraphs, figures, definition lists. A very simple change here for technical content. We are allowing a phrase within the content model of glossary elements, which then will enable the use of the highlight domain in glossary elements, particularly subscripts and superscripts. Very necessary and a change needed by folks who are working in physical sciences or medical fields. So simple, straightforward, I think very little change for vendors here. We also have made some fairly wide-scale improvements to the hazard statement. And this was introduced in DITA 1.2, and we knew that the content model as introduced in DITA 1.2 was not really aligned well with the ANSI 535.6 standard. We also knew that content authors wanted to be able to use ordered and unordered lists when specifying how to avoid standard, and wanted to reduce the reliance that they had on output class to get the formatting they needed to do things, for example, like enable use of multiple hazard symbols. So because this was rather a full-scale change to hazard and statement, I think DITA 1.x markup for many hazard statements might be invalid and need to be restructured, and that there probably will be changes to style sheets, to CSS for how hazard statements should be rendered in authoring environments. If folks have built any wizards to assist authors in inserting hazard statements, those will need to be touched. And also because we've made some changes to the specialization base of some of hazard statement itself and also of some of the sub-elements, this will affect style sheets. And I don't have it mentioned here, but any data source in which the class attribute values are made explicit will be affected here, as also will be the case for any other changes where we have made changes to the specialization base of elements. Another proposal here that I championed was improving to indexing. And this was largely driven again by our desire to, where we could, remove complexity, make things simpler, make it easier for processors to build reliable, consistent support. And we, in the implementation of this, we have removed the indexing domain and added the index C and index C also elements, which the domain previously contained, to the base. We've removed the index base and index sort as elements. Index sort as can be replaced by the sort as element, and we've improved the specification content here. So I don't think there'll be a lot of changes required here by vendors, but there is changes to the DITA sources that will crop up here. We did a pretty full-scale enhancement to simple table. This is all backwards compatible in terms of the DITA source, but what we are enabling is adding a title to the simple table and enabling row and column spanning. We did this for a number of reasons. First, we really wanted to ensure that DITA 2.0 had the appropriate base that lightweight DITA requires. We also wanted to provide DITA practitioners with a more useful base from which they could specialize table types. This proposal was driven and championed by Carlos Evia at Virginia Tech. And I do know that this will require changes to DITA authoring tools that pretty much across the board have some wizard and helping features for inserting tables, and have menu items to make it easier for authors to merge table cells, columns, rows. Another change here that comes in the technical content package is that we're making changes for steps. And we are enabling steps to nest and removing substeps and substep. This will enable better reuse of steps and step elements. It will let people have more than 2 levels of steps, and will let people more clearly define in their subsequent levels of steps whether they should be ordered or unordered. So clear changes to DITA sources. DITA source will have to happen here for content that needs to be moved forward to DITA 2.0 if substeps were used. And again, this was work championed by Robert Anderson at Oracle. And Robert, anything you'd like to add here?
Not really, other than this has been one of the best received, even if somewhat trivial in design, changes that I've talked about at various venues.
I think any of us that have authored DITA content and written a topic, had some substeps, and then suddenly realized we need to reuse the content of those substeps in another topic, have felt the pain of the steps and substeps design. And hopefully this change will mitigate that. We have a change to the troubleshooting topic that was introduced in DITA 1.3, and this is work championed by Don Stevens at Comtech. And it addresses the fact that the troubleshooting topic did not have a clear semantic place to add diagnostic information. So the implementation of this is fairly clear and straightforward. We're adding 3 new elements: diagnostics, which can contain either diagnostics general or diagnostic steps. I will say that This is one feature that we have already gotten some feedback that we're looking at that might lead the technical committee to make a slight change in the content model for diagnostics. So stay posted for this one. And we're very interested in the feedback that any vendors, any users who are test driving DITA 2.0 might have to provide for us. We have a new include element, and this is really to handle inclusion of code or
Chris, you are muted right now.
Okay.
There she
Yeah,
goes.
I'm not, I saw a message that the host had muted me. Am I unmuted?
You are unmuted now.
Okay.
Sorry about that. I'm not sure exactly what happened.
Okay. And I'll just start from the top of the slide since I don't know when I got muted. We have a new include element with the purpose of better handling inclusion of code and text. And we are using the inclusion element as a new specialization base for code ref, SVG ref, and MathML ref. So this is championed by Chris Nitchie. And Chris, any additional comments or elaboration on this?
Yeah, just a bit. Previously, those elements were based on XREF, and so processors had to just know that these references were special and meant inclusion instead of link. And so the purpose of this really is to allow processors and other DITA practitioners to create their own inclusion elements that require no special plugins, no special code for processors to recognize.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that clarification and elaboration. Another change here, and this was, again, really driven by functionality that we needed to have in place for lightweight DITA, is we've added multimedia elements to the base. And we've just wanted to make it much simpler for content authors to add audio and video to DITA topics. We have added audio and video elements, also 3 sub-elements for controls. The implications here are really changes to wizards, if they're wizards, or menu and items or icons for inserting multimedia. And this is work I've done, but I do want to acknowledge that it is built on work that Chris Nitchie did to develop a DITA 1.3 compatible domain for multimedia. We have a new domain for alternate titles. And I think the use cases here affect both DITA practitioners and DITA content authors. For practitioners, we wanted a clear way to be able to specialize elements for titles, book subtitles, window titles. And for content and map authors, we wanted to make it much simpler and straightforward for how and where navigation titles are used and rendered. So we have added an alternative titles domain, and the implementation here really involves the following changes: removing the title alts element, adding a new element called title alt, and making it available in Prologue in topics and topic meta in maps. The new title alt attribute is used as a new specialization base for search title, for nav title, for link title, subtitle, and title hint. We are removing lock title, and the table hint element will replace the nav title element when it existed without lock title and was simply there to provide a hint to map authors as to what the topic ref element referenced. Work championed by Chris Nitchie, and Chris, please chime in here with any additional information, clarification, or elaboration. I'm not sure I've given your proposal and your work full justice here.
Sure. Just to say, similar to the inclusion proposal, this is a way for alternate titles to be specified in a standard way. If you actually look at the DITA source for the DITA 1.3 specification, you'll see a lot of subtitles and alternate titles that are implemented as bookmap title alts, or I forget exactly how they're done, but they're done in a kind of odd way. And I think that's a fairly common practice. Another thing that happens, particularly with bookmap, is when you have a bookmap that has a title and then a subtitle, those are actually phrase elements within the map title element, which means, once again, a processor has to just know that this title is special and these phrases within this title need to be treated in a special way. This is a way to kind of try to get away from those workarounds around the limitations of not having an extensible alternate title mechanism by basically providing one. It does introduce its fair share of incompatibility with DITA 1.3 because of things related to lock title and the way some of these elements worked and were part of the base vocabulary in previous versions of DITA. So there is a little bit of a migration cost here, but at the benefit of vastly increased flexibility and extensibility and processability of alternate titles in general.
Thanks,
also want to
Chris.
note there's a typo in the last bullet there. It should be title hint rather than table hints.
Thanks, Robert. I will make sure I make that change before we create a PDF of this and post it on SlideShare. I think we've covered this in our discussion. Again, the implications, the migration costs here are, changes to DITA source required, changes to some style sheets, although we will be making, I think, style sheets much easier in the future. And again, if changes to DITA source for any CCMS that in the process of storing DITA content makes default attributes like the class attribute explicit in the source. We are adding a new emphasis domain that simply contains the strong and M elements. By default, this will be added to all technical content topic types and provides a alternative to the highlighting domain for folks who want a more precise and more semantic domain that is more in alignment with HTML5. And this was work that was championed by Keith Shangley Roberts of Precision Content. We have a new hardware domain, and this addresses use cases brought forward by authors who wanted to have clearer markup to indicate hardware controls and who wanted to be able to avoid using output class to distinguish between different types of controls. So the hardware domain has just two elements, hardware control and part number, and by default, it is integrated into all technical content topics. The technical committee really spent substantial time on this proposal. We looked at the possibility of containing having this domain contain more specific elements, but we really defaulted to simply trying to provide the real basics here, because we felt that so many companies and different industry verticals had slightly varying needs for what they would actually be doing here, and that they would be better meant by companies doing individual specializations of the elements in this domain. And this was work championed by one of the newest DITA TC voting members, Zoe Lawson, who really has had a big effect on DITA 2.0 and is a very valued and valuable member. We have a lot of changes here that, for the purpose of previous presentations to more of the user community, we put together in this one behind the scenes changes. And I do think, however, that these changes will have a large impact on vendors, on data practitioners, on style sheet developers. So I'll walk through these one by one and try to give more commentary about the implications here. We've made output class universal. All of the filtering attributes, audience, platform, products, other prompts, are now created as attribute specializations of prompts. So this, of course, really will affect all in any DITA 2.0 document type shells, but we do expect that everyone will need everybody who has their own document type shells will need to create new DITA 2.0 based document type shells. We resolved some inconsistent class attribute values for short desc, link text, and search title. And again, a hit here to style sheets and to any data source that makes the class attribute values explicit. In a similar vein, we changed the specialization base for a few additional elements, including image map, in order to simply use a more correct, more appropriate base. We removed the XTRF and XTRC attributes that were originally added for debugging purposes. We know that some implementations and some vendors have used those attributes for their own purposes. And I think if that is the case for your company, for your implementation, the simplest thing to do will be to specialize those attributes and add them back to your document type shells. We've split the syntax and programming domain so that the syntax diagram elements are now in a separate domain. We also removed the domains attribute and replaced it with a specialization attribute. And Robert, you championed quite a large number of these proposals. So I'd like to ask if there's anything you'd like to add or clarify or elaborate on here.
I think a lot of these are really cleanup items. Like the first one, output class, is available almost everywhere in DITA 1.3, so this is just making it available so we don't have people saying, oh, why isn't it allowed here? Removing some legacy stuff, splitting syntax and programming domain, that's just an acknowledgement that a pretty significant number of those who might want to make use of the programming domain don't actually use syntax diagrams. So it's splitting it into two domains that just makes it easier to not have that big chunk of syntax diagram elements show up while still using the others. Probably the more noteworthy one is the domains attribute, which is really language simplification. It's the idea that the domains attribute had grown over time to fulfill a lot of theoretical ideas that didn't really, well, they weren't practically speaking worth the cost of the implementations. And so it's getting rid of most of what was placed in that attribute, shifting over to the specializations attribute, which becomes for now just a way to track specialized attributes. That's really the one case where we needed to have domain information so that processors can recognize specialized attributes and how to handle them.
So, for example, that also will simplify the creation of document type shells for practitioners who are including constraints or expansion modules in the document type shells. Constraints will no longer be required to add a token to the old domains, now the specializations attribute. Another thing we are doing, and this will have a clear migration cost for existing DITA content, is we are removing all items that were characterized as deprecated, reserved for future use, or anything that we added by mistake and had to keep in the grammar files in order to ensure backwards compatibility. And this is one of the very first proposals we approved. I championed this, and it really was very much with the intent of reducing our technical debt, getting rid of cruft, and starting with a cleaner, fresher slate. So this will, as I mentioned, have a large impact on folks' existing data source. All the things that were marked in DITA 1.2 and 1.3, or even since DITA 1.1 as deprecated, all that markup will be invalid. And I've listed out here the 4 I think that will probably have the most effect on existing content. And that is the alt attribute on image, which was replaced in DITA 1.2, released in 2010 with the alt element, the nav title attribute on topograph and topograph specializations, again, also marked as deprecated in 2010 and replaced with the nav title element, the title attribute on map, and the print attribute. I would think for vendors who produce CCMS that this might be a place that your customers would be very much looking for any possibility of scripting or help that you might provide in an automated way for migrating DITA 1.x topics to DITA 2.0 with corrections to the sort of markup. We do have a link here for how you can get to the DITA 2.0 stage 2 proposal for this work, number 36, remove deprecated items. And if any tools that are currently produced insert the alt attribute or the nav title attribute, please make changes and fixes there. I'm only aware of one editing environment that is embedded in a CCMS that does by default insert the alt attribute. We have some other cases where we simply removed certain attributes, elements, and domains. And these are things that we thought were very little used or were duplicates of something you could do with existing markup. That's certainly the case with the topic set and the topic set ref elements. We were not aware of anyone using the delayed conref domain. We removed a token from the type attribute on note, the token being fastpath, again, one that we're not aware really of people using. And finally, we also removed copy to and the lock meta attributes. Blockmeta had really no defined meaning in the specification. And copy to, although we know it is heavily used, we felt copy to was a not really appropriate attribute for the DITA specification. We are, however, replacing it with some other architectural mechanisms and markup that could signify appropriate intent by authors for renaming of resources in the processing component of a DITA implementation. Anyone on any TC member want to elaborate at all on copy to?
I'll just note that I think the replacement is a little bit better designed. It's a little more flexible. So right now, the copy to attribute as designed was really designed around and tied to one specific implementation or processing design of content that's processed sequentially through a processing tool chain for generating HTML. And the replacement is based around the resource ID element and is meant to be a lot more flexible so that you can define alternate anchors for HTML output files, but also for an anchor in a PDF or for whatever other system you're using.
Thanks, Robert. Finally, we are not shipping XSD for DITA 2.0. We know that there's some tools out there that rely on XSD, and our suggestion is that you simply generate monolithic versions of the DITA 2.0 DTDs if you need XSD. And our reason for not shipping it, it really comes down to a question of resources. And the technical committee didn't have the time and the bandwidth to keep developing and maintaining XSD in addition to DTD and RNG. And the fact that DITA 2.0 was, allowed us to break backwards compatibility, enabled us to make this change. In a similar mode, there are certain specializations that were present in DITA 1.x releases that are not present in 2.0. And here we have learning and training, the machinery task topic, and the task prerequisites domain that was used in the machinery task topic. And while we are not including these as part of the DITA 2.0 OASIS standard, we will be updating these specializations for DITA 2.0 and making them available in a OASIS open GitHub repository. In much similar to why we're not shipping XSD, we are not shipping these specializations because we did not have the resources with the appropriate skill set active on the DITA Technical Committee to keep these specializations maintained, up to date, and in a healthy state. We're hoping the fact that we'll be making these available in OASIS open GitHub repositories means that companies that use these specializations or practitioners that frequently use them for clients will be able to work with others in OASIS open repositories to update, maintain, and improve these specializations. OASIS membership is not required for people to work in OASIS open GitHub repositories. Those are workplaces where the technical committee can work with folks that are not members of OASIS. And finally, and I know we're getting close to the top of the hour here, I really wanted to draw people's attention to the resources we have available here. And first off, and perhaps the most important thing, we have tagged and packaged beta versions of our DTD and RNG files for both the base and the technical content. And the URLs here are what you need for that. I'm hoping, Robert, perhaps you can make these URLs available in the chat. And then of course, we can have these included in a follow-up email and in the PDF of this webinar that we'll make available shortly on SlideShare. Again, we've got a follow-up webinar scheduled for June 29th, which is 2 weeks from today at the same time. And this webinar will be really dedicated to questions and answers, the questions, the comments, the thoughts and concerns that we got on today's webinar that we did not have time to get to. And also, I've given you an email here, ditachair@list.oasisopen.org, where you can send questions in advance of the webinar on the 29th. So if you've got somebody else at your company that you think needs to watch this webinar, a recording of this webinar, and then attend the follow-up session, we've made this possible. Again, the recording will be available as soon as possible, perhaps even today. And we've got the link here to register for the webinar. And Dee or Jane at OASIS, if you could get that webinar registration URL available in the chat, that would be, I would really appreciate that. And finally, we do have, we've got a very few minutes here for questions. And I'll ask Deb, I know you were monitoring chat and Q&A. Are there some questions that we perhaps could address in the next 3 or 4 minutes?
Yes, Robert did answer, but one question came in. Can you explain the bookmap change auto-generated updates?
And I think simply what we enabled here was adding, modifying the content model of book lists in order to make it possible for somebody to indicate clearly to a processor that this would be a place where there should be an automatically included list of changes. And we can address that in more detail on the 29th also.
Another question, and I think you've already answered this, was why are XSDs removed and DTDs still supported?
Well, RNGs are our normative format for our grammar fonts. We also know that there are only 1 or 2 applications out there that currently support RNGs, that most of the products in the DITA universe require DTDs, a handful require XSDs. So that is why we are continuing to support DTDs, because the number of tools that require XSDs are substantially smaller. That was the place that where we had to make a cut. And we do very much hope that vendors of DITA tooling will start introducing, certainly please consider for the next release of your product, for a release of the product that supports DITA 2.0, consider whether your product could support the DITA grammar files in RNG format. It is much easier for practitioners to create document type shells, to create constraints, to create expansion modules, and to do specializations in RNG. And it is our normative format.
And Chris, I'll just note if it helps, that question about XSDs came in before you got to the slide. So yeah.
One more question. Oh, do we want to take it, or it is top of the hour?
It is top of the hour, so I really want very much to thank everybody. And please register for the webinar on the 29th. Questions that came in today that we didn't have time to get to, we will take then. And we will also take any questions that you forwarded to the chair email address. So I want to thank everybody, and I will stop sharing right now. And thanks again for Deb Bizantz, for Robert Anderson, and Chris Nitchie for additionally taking part in this webinar. They'll also be present on the 29th.